Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. Hi, great to have you with us on the HFE Hub. I'm Sharon Todd. Today, our podcast is being hosted by Kath Jones. She's chatting with Sandra Lam about the psychological health of fly-in, fly-out workers.
Hello and welcome to HFE Hub. My name is Kath Jones and I'm currently the General Secretary of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. Today's instalment is something a bit different. It's brought from you from the west coast of this big wide country where I am meeting with Sandra Lam. Hi Sandra.
Hi Kath, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for joining me today. Sandra is an endorsed Organisational Psychologist and the Managing Director of FIFO Focus, which is a team of registered psychologists and behavioural consultants who work directly in the fly-in, fly-out employment sector to identify and manage psychosocial risk areas of this type of work. And FIFO Focus supports organisations to handle the complexity of psychological health amongst remote workers. Now, Sandra has over 2 decades of industry experience in the public and private sectors in Australia and overseas. And throughout her career, Sandra has assisted organisations to improve organisational performance by making workplaces safer, more engaging and more enjoyable. Now, I met Sandra a few years back, I think, wasn't it?
So.
Yeah, through mutual colleagues. Now, you were just starting FIFO Focus at the time, I believe.
I think it was 2000, I don't know when we met, but we started FIFO Focus 2015, 2016 mark.
Great, around then. Well, now, I don't know if it's confirmation bias or a testament to how much work you've done with the mining sector, but I have continued to hear about you and FIFO Focus a lot in my discussions. And so I'm really looking forward to talking to you about the type of work you do,
Thank you.
particularly to help these mining companies design safe and engaging workplaces. But I'd like to start by asking you about your journey into organisational psychology as a profession.
Oh gosh, that was a long time ago. I started in, I don't even know what year it was, but I was doing my undergraduate at UWA, doing psychology, and I loved it then. But I'm the type of person who likes to make things difficult for myself at times. So rather than just do a straight psychology degree, I decided to do a bit of commerce as well. And that's when I realised I don't really want to head down the clinical psychology line like most people want to when they do psychology. And I decided I'll go and do org psych. And at that point in time, it's about 20-something years ago, org psych wasn't a big thing in Australia. It was huge in the UK, and that profession was really well respected. But in Australia, it was still very confusing for a lot of people, and they were thinking, organisational psychologists, do you just teach people how to organise themselves? And that was the belief. But for me, it was, I love complex problems, and there's nothing more complex than the brain. And when you put the brain in a workplace with all these other variables, it makes it even more complex. And that's when I thought psychology is definitely for me. So I did my master's at Curtin. And then I did my MBA because why not?
You do like to make things difficult.
I do. And I think the reason I did that is because when you do organisational psychology, the confusion is if you're not organising people, then you're just dealing with people's problems. But when you throw an MBA on the top of that, people realise you're talking about business systems.
Yes.
So it really gave it that additional credibility, which is, we love it. We use everything to do with human behaviour, workplace design, all the stuff that you do in business, but with a psychological slant to it, and that's fascinating.
It's so interesting you mentioned as well the business systems, because systems thinking is so much part of human factors, and in many ways organisational psychologists are really well suited to thinking in a systems way, because you need to consider all of the factors in the physical and the social environment to understand behaviour. It's
kind of like I say human factors is a combination of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I consider it a combination of psychology with engineering with ergonomics.
Yeah.
So, and all of that is very systems-based. So
Absolutely,
it absolutely makes sense to do org psych and human factors together.
Exactly. Well, it's great that you're on the podcast to speak with us today, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about what FIFO Focus has been doing since 2015 or so when you started, and the types of projects that you undertake. Can you tell us a bit more?
Sure. We have a vision to create psychologically healthy workplaces, and we've had that vision since 2015. So everything that we do work towards that as well. So our 5 pillars of work are predominantly psychosocial hazards and risk management, which makes sense because when you prevent hazards, you create mentally healthy workplaces. We do a lot in the mental health space as well, because we're talking about the individual also. And for when we do mental health work, we're essentially talking about training people up on mental health first aid or peer support or just general mental health in the positive way, like thriving. How do you do that? Positive psychology type of work as well. We do a fair bit in trauma-informed approaches as well now, because in the mining industry in Western Australia, there's this big issue with sexual harassment, as you would all know.
Yes.
So talking about trauma-informed components is very important, how to do this in a trauma-sensitive fashion when you're talking about investigations into sexual harassment. We also, because we're FIFO focused, we focus a lot on preparing people for the FIFO life. So we know through some research a long time ago that a lot of people go into FIFO thinking it's just about the money, but not really consider the challenges that's associated with FIFO. So this program really essentially helps them and their partner understand and plan for and consider the challenges and how do they respond when things go wrong, just to make sure that their FIFO life is highly productive and healthy for them as well. And then finally, we do team development, leadership development, because you can't really do creating psychologically healthy workplaces and deal with all of these psychosocial risks if you don't consider the team and the leader as well. So we do that piece of work. But we just don't pick up any work. It has to be linked to creating mentally healthy workplaces for us. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And look, going back to why fly in, fly out work, and you and I being, in the west coast of the country, we're very familiar with the term FIFO. But for those listeners who aren't familiar with fly in, fly out work and the work arrangements, what are those unique challenges? Why specifically would you focus on the fly in, fly out work arrangements?
It's because you're quite isolated. So for those who don't know, fly in, fly out arrangements is when you have to go away for weeks on end. It used to be weeks on end, but now we do have rosters, which is 8 days on and then 6 days off, meaning 8 days on site and then 6 days back. When you're away, you're not around, a hub where you can access all the lovely things that you normally can access. I can't just go out for a coffee and go to the movies and that sort of thing. You are basically stuck in a village or the camp, and you only do what is available to you there. On top of that, you're working quite long hours. So we're talking 12-hour shifts with really no real break. And, a lot of people who are on the tools, so to speak, they would probably have a 15-minute morning tea, a half an hour lunch, and another 15-minute afternoon tea out of their whole 12-hour shift, which is a very, very long period to be working. And sometimes it's very physical labour, sometimes it's cognitive, sometimes it's both. And so the isolation from everybody, their family and the friends, especially for those with really young families, is very difficult for them because they're not seeing the kids grow up. When things go wrong, and invariably lots of things go wrong when they're on site, how do they deal with that? Because they can't just pop home and fix it and come back. So that's where it becomes really difficult as well. You're working with a whole bunch of people and you're stuck with them on camp as well. So if they're people you don't necessarily get along with, you're pretty much feeling isolated even though there's lots of people around you. So we know that there's lots of research that says 1 in 3 FIFO workers experience psychological distress is because of the roster, the environment, the workload, the length of time that you work, the separation from the intimate loved ones. Sometimes on these sites the Wi-Fi doesn't work, sometimes planes are delayed, all of these things that over time can really just chip away at your mental health.
Yeah. And we've actually had a lot of research in that area over here and then right throughout Australia, I believe, on the effects of mental health for FIFO work. And I noticed from my own experience that a lot of the issues that we see are amplified in terms of behavioural issues that we see on site. So that lack of that social support that you talked about, your peer networks at home, your family, your friends, you would normally be able to debrief with or unload on. Without that, and then being that smaller issues can become quite amplified. Would you say that's true?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Especially when you've got such a roster. So I talked about the 8 and 6, but your more common rosters are your 2 and 1s, 2 weeks on, 1 week off. If you have an argument with your partner, it drags on for days because you can't just sort it out. You can't sit together, hold each other's hand, goes, let's just sort this out, and have multiple hours and hours on end trying to sort this out. You can't do that when you're on site, because if you finish at, say, 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, you do have to get up about 3.
Yeah.
So when you get back to your camp, you have to shower, you have to go and eat some food, you might want to exercise. By that time you don't have many hours left, so there's not a lot of time to sit with your partner and just work things through.
Yeah.
So
smaller things can become quite large. And how do you think organisations that you deal with, how do you think that they are currently dealing with these kinds of complexities? I know that in WA we've had the psychosocial regulations now since December 2022, so that's given a bit more guidance for what workplaces can do. But what's your experience with how particularly the mining industry is dealing with these challenges?
I think one of the best things that had happened was the change in the rosters for a fair few people. So that was a result of the parliamentary inquiry into the FIFO suicides. So I think at that point we were seeing rosters that were horrendous. We're talking 4 and 1, 3 and 1, spending 4 weeks on, 1 week off, and with lots of night shifts in between. And since then, we've had lots more family-friendly rosters, meaning they're more even-based, whether that's 2 and 2, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or 8 and 6. So I think that's made a big difference. The other thing that's made a really big difference is access to technology. Your Wi-Fi. So I remember starting in camp where you just do not get a signal, and people would be going up to the top of the hill and pull their phone up to hopefully get a signal so they can call their partner. But these days you do have better Wi-Fi, so that helps a lot as well. So I think when you're talking about better rosters, better communication, preparation for people to do FIFO, and including their partners understanding what this means, family days rather, where they bring their partner up to site so the partner is aware of what it really feels like to work on site, although they never get them to wake up until 3 o'clock in the morning, but so maybe that would make them understand a little bit more. But I think some of those things are helping. But there's still a long way to go because it's still hard.
But you're really talking about work design principles.
Absolutely.
So designing a shift is a great example where you're not putting it back on the worker to change their behaviour, but rather setting the workplace up so it's better for the worker.
Yeah.
And so that really goes to the heart of what FIFO Focus does with some of the consultation that you do. You look at how the organisation can work to support engaging and mentally healthy work. But I'm interested in particularly with the health behaviours that come from better rosters. We know that you're much less likely to be reliant on alcohol or other stimulants in a mine site in order to meet those needs that you might normally have. And also when you talk about some of the other changes they see at mine sites, I've also noticed they've removed they've rather introduced non-alcohol related activities so that people feel that they can engage in something other than work. Well, they're still at work, technically.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's really interesting in talking about those health behaviours and really some of the factors you brought up. You mentioned isolation, and that's exacerbated sometimes by poor Wi-Fi and shift length, as we've already discussed, work demands and some of those conflicts. Can you talk to me a bit more about why workplaces need to be looking at those factors? Do they actually cause harm to health in and of themselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because when it comes to why people don't do so well with their mental health, it's not linear. There's no one reason, it's multiple reasons. And it could be because they feel isolated, they're not supported, they have a high workload, and they may possibly even not getting treated right, and that will impact someone's mental health. And other times it could just be too much work demand in isolation to everything else, but without the protective factor of good support. So when it comes to measuring the drivers of poor mental health, you can't just look for one thing. It's often a combination and the interaction of multiple hazards and risk factors.
Okay.
Yeah.
And am I right that some of those factors aren't always risk factors? So we know from Karasek's job demand model that, we can improve outcomes by improving control over the demands. If you have high demands but have high autonomy, you can address some of those issues. What are some of the key protective factors, do you think?
Yeah, so the ones that we read a lot more about and we know there's evidence for is high control and high support. So supervisory support is really important. But I'm going to put my money on the fact that role clarity is also a big protective factor. And I think if there's more research being done, you'll see that is very much a protective factor as well. Because human nature is one where we want to have an idea about what we're trying to do. So what does good look like? What do you expect of me? How am I measured? All of those things can de-stress me a little bit. If I'm just plodding along hoping that whatever I'm doing is what my supervisor wants me to do, you're stabbing in the dark. So I think if I was going to put money on anything, it'll be role clarity, job autonomy, and also good support from the supervisor, but ideally also the colleagues as well.
Exactly. So one could almost change the recipe. If you put a few more ingredients in, you could actually have a better outcome, even if there is long shift length or even if there are high job demands. You could negate those effects.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of like that if you are more likely to, or you're very happy to work really hard for a really good boss.
Yeah.
So if you measure that, it's high work demand but high support. But that if you're working really hard, you're not even getting any recognition and no support, then it's going to have an impact on your mental health because you're going, why am I doing this? No one's even seeing me and no one's thanking me. So when you think it through, it kind of is quite obvious.
Yeah. It's which brings me onto the topic, I think, of how much you do with FIFO focus in risk assessment work. How do you show, or how do you how do you assist a workplace to measure those factors and to understand them? What methods do you use?
So we have our own little proprietary method to do it because traditionally risk assessments assume linearity. So we would say this is a hazard, what's the likelihood, what's the consequence, and then may consider frequency, duration, severity, but generally we don't for psychosocial, but we should. But what we're finding is you need to be looking at a whole bunch of them together. So the approach that we have is interactive, and it helps the participants work through the story of the hazards. So instead of working line by line, we'll get them to think about all the different hazards that is relevant to them. We think about which ones had the biggest impact on them, how frequently they are exposed to them, for what duration, and what's the consequence and impact of that. And then using our approach, they actually see the story. So sometimes what we find is it's not the high work demands that they need to put controls in place for, it's the things that led to the high work demands, like role clarity, lack of support, poor recognition. So our approach allows us to do that, and we're pretty proud of it, but it's not the easiest thing for a lot of people because traditionally risk assessments have been done on likelihood and consequence with a 5x5 matrix, and it simply doesn't work for psychosocial because they all interact with each other and they can also cancel each other out, like we mentioned earlier on with protective factors.
So it is much more complex without a cause and effect that's as clear as with some physical hazards. Do you find that you're getting a good success rate with this kind of collaborative risk assessment approach? How do you get all of the workers involved, and how do you choose a work area? Tell me about that.
So we do it like a health and hygiene model. So we break the groups into similar exposure groups. So if you are a hygienist, you understand what that means. When you're on site, you're often exposed to toxic levels of dust, sound, whatever. And when you're a hygienist, you measure how frequently and of what duration you're exposed to those particular physical hazards, and then there's a toxicity level, and then you go, that's the risk. So we use a similar model for psychosocial because invariably it's the same sort of thing. You can handle a certain level of lack of role clarity, but after a certain point you can't. So we need to consider psychosocial hazards like a health and hygiene type model rather than your safety model when someone's broke and you've got to fix it. So I kind of look at health and safety like likelihood and consequence, and I look at psychosocial, that's health and hygiene with frequency and duration. That's the way my brain works. I'm not sure if that's exactly the right way, and I think it's an area that's quite complex, and we're still trying to work out exactly how this might look and work on the ground, but that's where we're sitting at the moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of practitioners, you bang on, they need really a way to simplify what is complex, and I think that's a great approach to think about it like an exposure level, as you would with a hygiene issue. Which brings me to one of the reasons I really wanted to chat with you in this podcast. It was a suggestion that was made after we were at a forum where we were doing some myth busting around what people think about psychosocial hazards, because there's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes that I've seen, and I know that you have in your work as well, about what workplaces should be doing to manage psychosocial risks. And I'd love for us to talk about some of those myths that we debunked, as it were. I think the first one you came up with was, look, psychological safety is the same as psychological health and safety. Why did you choose that as a myth, and talk to me about it?
Because it's one that's been going on for a long time, and I'm not anti-psychological safety. Just for clarity, psychological safety is sort of encouraging people to speak up. So it's very much similar to the Amy Edmondson model of, speaking up and challenging, that sort of thing. I think that's really important. You want your people to be able to speak up, but just focusing your efforts on getting people to speak up isn't going to meet your legislative obligations, your work health and safety obligations of trying to identify and control for psychosocial hazards. So that controlling and identify psychosocial hazards is really about psychological health and safety, or psychosocial safety, if you want to just sort of abbreviate it a bit. So psychological safety is very much about speaking up. Psychosocial safety is the risk management approach, which is legislative, that you need to do to identify things that are causing harm in the workplace. Of course, people speaking up about things that can cause harm in the workplace is exactly what you want. So of course, if you have good psych safety, it would help you with your psychosocial safety as well. But just focusing on helping people to speak up, in many ways you're abrogating your responsibility. You're saying that I won't take a proactive approach to identify the hazards in the workplace. I'll only do it when you tell me there's something wrong.
Yes, good point. And really that's one of the old school mentalities, that there's not a problem if I don't hear that there is a problem.
That's right.
And now, I guess, with our legislation being so much more on the risk management approach, where like with every hazard you need to identify it before it occurs, how should a workplace be identifying psychosocial hazards?
Do it proactively. So I would be saying, consider all the different work groups. Are there some that are a little bit more, and I use the term loosely, vulnerable, because not everyone's vulnerable, but more of the high-risk minority group? Are they exposed to some of these hazards more than others? So a classic example are your camp utility staff. The reason they're considered more at risk is because they're normally probably from another country. It's insecure work. They're probably in a culture where you don't speak up about these things because you don't bite the hand that feeds you. So there's all of these sort of assumptions, and they're not likely to speak up about anything. They're more exposed to some of the bad behaviours in the workplace because people behave badly in camp with this alcohol involved. So they're the ones that's probably most at risk. So I would be looking at all the different groups within my workplace that are exposed to these risks, and then conduct a proactive psychosocial risk assessment on those groups. That's how you stay ahead of the game, rather than waiting for an injury to occur and go, whoops, where did we go wrong?
So you've prioritised those vulnerable groups, and then you think, okay, I'm going to start the risk assessment. Is it a survey? Is it what does it look like?
So it depends on the group, and I would say for those groups, surveys may not necessarily work, because you might be looking at surveys that's written, and some of these people are not good with reading English. So I would much rather do it in a sort of a focus group interactive way, but picking your facilitator is very important in this sort of space as well. You don't want it to be a leader, because there's a power differential there, so it's being really selective about who you pick. When you're doing risk assessments, you can do multiple different approaches. You can do surveys, you can do focus groups, or you can just do observations and just check in with different groups at different points in time.
And of course there's data that can help you in the workplace to support that, such as turnover and the use of sick leave and other data such as exit interviews. People that might might share information on the way out the door that could
Yes.
be really vital, right?
Yes.
So excellent. So one of the first myths, and I think that was well debunked, as it were, psychological safety is a component of psychosocial safety. Important component, but not a standalone and not enough, which I think is really well put. Another one of those myths that came up in our forum was workplaces, if they have a sexual harassment policy and they've got interventions about sexual harassment, then they're basically meeting their psychosocial safety requirements.
Yeah, the myth with that one is because people misunderstand what psychological health and safety or psychosocial safety is. And it really stemmed in WA in particular because the Enough is Enough report in mining came out roughly the same time as the psychosocial code of practice came out. So there was this belief that psychosocial equals sexual harassment, so therefore if we deal with sexual harassment, we're dealing with psychosocial. Sexual harassment is one component of psychosocial hazards. And we're seeing research now that links the two as well. So there's a landmark study, again, in mining in WA, where they've found that sexist and sexual hostility are more likely to result in sexual harassment, but what's correlated with sexist and sexual hostility are psychosocial hazards like lack of role clarity, no support, low autonomy, and no training. So we're saying that if you're going to deal with sexual harassment in isolation to hazards, you might not be looking at the root causes.
Yeah.
So that's why it's really important to look at everything together, because one does affect the other.
It's a really good point. And just for those who aren't from WA or might not be in Australia, the Enough is Enough report specifically looked at sexual harassment in the mining sector, and that came about from some of the studies done beforehand on suicides in FIFO. That report came up with some really strong recommendations for WHS regulators, but it also coincided with a wider change in Australia on WHS laws, because traditionally we only looked really at bullying as a hazard. Now it's expanded greatly. No, it's not even just bullying and sexual harassment. It's bullying, it's sexual harassment, it's conflict. Then there's also the other factors like we spoke about. So when you mentioned about having sexual harassment policies is not enough, to meet psychosocial safety requirements now, you're saying you really need to have policies and procedures for all of those hazards, or that consider all of those hazards.
I think you need to at least conduct risk assessments of a psychosocial nature every time there's been a psychological injury that has occurred, like bullying, harassment, sexual harassment.
Yeah.
So, yes, of course, you need to deal with the sexual harassment incident as well, and to work out what's happened and substantiation, all that sort of stuff. But you need to also look at where controls failed, because it should never have got to that point. And when you're doing that, you're essentially looking at psychosocial anyway. That's
a really good point. So really looking at those inappropriate workplace behaviours as a consequence of poor psychosocial risk management, rather than a hazard in and of itself. It's a consequence of something that fell apart.
We know that there's psychosocial hazards as antecedents to poor behaviours like bullying. So there's a research, I believe it's Sweden or somewhere in Scandinavia, where they worked out that in this particular organisation, they experienced low role clarity, and 3 years later there was increases of incidents of bullying.
Yeah.
So we know that from a psychological theory perspective, when you experience that frustration, people behave in a way that becomes the norm, and when it's normed, people behave badly as a result of that, and you're not making that link.
Yes.
So we're seeing so many links that way. So we're saying get curious on some of those drivers and those underlying root causes, because that's where you really prevent it, rather than just dealing with it once it's happened.
That's fantastic. And it really leads on to the third hazard, which was debunked in our myth-busting session. It was on psychosocial incidents, because they're generally behavioural in nature. They're the obvious ones. They're the ones that we see, aren't they? The sexual harassment, the bullying, like we just spoke about. But because they are behavioural, human resources and human resource practitioners are the best people to conduct investigations into these. Why was this a myth, Sandra?
This is a myth because previously, before the Work Health and Safety legislation saying that health includes psychological health, it was HR who dealt with this, because anything to do with people behaving badly equals HR. And HR are very skilled in dealing with that sort of incidents from a substantiation and disciplinary perspective. They need to. Someone has alleged X, Y, and Z. We need to test whether it's true or not. And then what do we do with the people that did behave badly? I get that. But that's not what the work health and safety legislation wants you to do. The work health and safety legislation says, where did all your controls fall over? HR are not equipped to do that. It's health and safety who are. So this is a classic case of just because some of these behaviours traditionally fell under the HR remit doesn't mean it continues to do that unless HR picks up on understanding risk assessments and looking at failures of control. And I know from a regulator perspective, you go in and do look at it from a controls perspective, but businesses don't. And now that's why it's no longer sufficient unless your HR people understand how to do psychosocial risk assessments.
So how would one upskill? I mean, one of the advantages I think I've heard from regulators around the country is the introduction of the regulations for psychosocial hazards actually stipulate what to consider when you're controlling for these hazards. So if you can't eliminate, how do you minimise? And there are a bunch of considerations that you have to list. Would it be enough for somebody to know that legislation to be competent to complete a psychosocial investigation?
I think where people fall over is the risk assessment bit. So when I think about the risk management model, we're talking about identifying the hazards, assessing the risk, putting controls in place, and monitoring the effectiveness of control. And the way I look at it is I think there's different groups within an organisation that can contribute to each of the 4 steps. So when we're talking about identifying the hazards, so who can do that? Well, your HR people can, because they've got exit interviews, they've got surveys, they've got engagement surveys, they've got, turnover data, absenteeism data, they've got that. And if you have a psychosocial slant over some of those data, you'd be able to look, there might be some hazards at play. For that, health and safety could as well, because we know there's a strong link between musculoskeletal injuries and psychosocial hazards. So health and safety can contribute towards identifying the hazards. If you have chaplains and peer supporters and mental health first aiders, and they're across psychosocial, they're in a great position because they're hearing it on the ground. So what we're saying is you have all of these different groups that can contribute towards the step 1, which is identify the hazards. It's step 2, conducting the risk assessment, which is very foreign to a lot of people. So that's predominantly been in the health and safety remit. So if your HR people can learn a bit more about how to conduct psychosocial risk assessment, so you can look at controls, residual controls, and all of that sort of work, then they're in a good position as well. But generally it's health and safety. And then you've got controls. Controls for psychosocial normally sits with HR and leaders. Because if you think about all the psychosocial hazards, it's very HR-y and very leader-y. So again, you've got HR and leaders doing well in that controls piece, and then monitoring the effectiveness is either HSE, your health and safety, or your risk management group that looks at the cadence of looking at the control effectiveness. So if we look at that risk model, it's not who owns it, it might be who's best to contribute to each part of it. That's the way we kind of look at it as well.
And it takes me back to what you said originally, what we're talking about with this behaviour not occurring in isolation. We're a part of a system, so you almost need a systems approach when you're investigating these types of hazards. You can't look at it from a linear perspective or a cause and effect perspective, or even from a did it happen or didn't it. We have to imagine, how did this event occur within the system? What factors within the system could have contributed to the event and the outcomes of the event? Would that be fair?
Yeah, pretty much. It's kind of like when you do an ICAMS. Right, you do look at the task, the person, the environment, the organisational, the absent and failed defences. You look at all of those things. With psychosocial, you do need to do that as well. ICAMS is not equipped to deal with psychosocial because it does drop that off a fair bit, but we should be looking at, throw your psychosocial lens on. Maybe there should be a whole category in psychosocial or a whole category in human factors, which is very closely linked to psychosocial. So they can be considered in your ICAMS investigation as well.
There's always so many methodologies, aren't there, for investigations, and you're never really sure where to go. But what I simplifying it in a way is that if HR is there to find did it happen or did it not and to blame, then WHS is the opposite. It is it's a no blame system that says regardless of whether or not it occurred, somebody's feeling aggrieved enough to bring this up as a potential risk to their safety and health.
Yeah.
So let's look at what systems may have failed to lead to this aggrieved person.
Great distinction. Yeah, no blame.
Thank you. I've got a joke that I made up actually about how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb, and
oh dear.
Well, the original one is none, because the light bulb has to want to change.
Gosh.
But with organisational psychologists, it should be none, because why do you have the light bulb in that room in the first place?
Oh, well,
change the room. I need to work on that. It's still in infancy. I'd like to really wrap this up really about the best practice. So what would you consider, because we've been talking a bit about how do workplaces respond, and I would love to double back on what you talked about with trauma-informed response as well. But when a workplace is told or becomes aware of a behaviour that's impacted health, what is the best practice for a work health and safety investigation?
The best practice doesn't quite exist yet. But when it comes to something like trauma-informed, the reason we talk about trauma-informed in these sensitive situations is we don't want to re-traumatise the person who was affected. And the reason that's been a risk is because we've moved from HR talking to the person to HR and health and safety and the leader and possibly the regulator and possibly the workers' compensation coming in to ask the person the same thing over and over again. What happened? And the person gets re-traumatized by that. So the best approach would be to take, we would say it's a case management approach, where you work together before you speak to the individual and say, what do we need together? For your purpose as a HR person, for my purpose as a health and safety failures and control perspective, what do we need to get from this person? And have that individual interact with one or maximum two people for the whole process. Because trauma-informed there's a few principles with being trauma-informed. It's about creating safety, creating trustworthiness, having a sense of control, being collaborative and empowerment, which means don't just take a traditional approach of investigations. When it comes to trauma, your brain and memory is highly affected. So don't expect a linear recount of what happened, because your brain will not do that. So people understanding that's why when you have someone who has been experiencing a traumatic event, they're not going to be able to say, well, 1633, this is what happened, and Joe Blogs walked in and then closed. They can't do that, because the brain is trying to protect them. So I think all investigators at the very least need to understand the impacts of trauma, and then also learn how to adjust their investigative techniques to ensure that they consider all of these things as well. And when we're talking about things like collaborate and control and empowerment, we're saying give some control back to the individual. Ask them what works for them in terms of when to meet, where to meet, make them feel safe. Because when they feel safe and when they feel like they're believed is when they can give you a lot more information, which is useful for everybody. So that's the trauma-informed component.
And look, there are some cases where people have been affected by a work-related event which is traumatising for them, be it a behaviour or even a significant near-miss event. They don't want to be part of an investigation. Can you still investigate without that affected person being involved throughout the process? Can they just provide an initial statement and we go from there?
I think you can, and I think that's a really good point, because not everyone wants to provide a witness statement. And often in the case of sexual harassment, you'll get the people saying, look, this happened to me, I just want it to stop, but I don't necessarily want the person to lose their job, because what happens then is the person now feels guilt that they created this, and what happens if I go in the workplace and now I'm going to be victimized because I got, there's all of these things that the person's thinking about, and we need to really help them work this thing through. So I think it's such a tough one. You can still investigate to see where things fell apart without having to speak to the person directly all the time. So you can speak to where did it happen? Was the lighting right? What's the psychosocial hazard around that area like? Do they have high workloads with low clarity and poor support? You can look at all of those. You can do those proactive work without talking to the individual. And then give them the option that they can talk to you at some other point in time as well. It's not a case of, well, you have until, X, Y, and Z time, and if you don't do it, too late, bye. It's not like that. It's like, say, look, you do what you need to do. We're going to help you we're going to support you through this. And at any point, please do come back to us, because we're trying to make this better for everybody as well as yourself. And that level of, empathy and trauma-informed considerations is helpful for everybody.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. We see a lot of secondary trauma coming from people who have, particularly when it comes to gendered violence, as we know, it can have some delayed effects, but also if you don't show that support or that trauma-informed response, you can cause some secondary trauma or where people feel that they're not believed or that they have to justify themselves. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Sandra, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Is there anything that you'd like to tell us a bit more about FIFO Focus before we go, or are you happy to sign
Thank you
off?
for the opportunity. It's just so nice, so easy to talk with you, Kath, as usual.
It's always a joy.
I just really, thank you for the opportunity. And we do a lot of work, and we create bespoke programs and bespoke solutions. We're not cookie cutter people. Probably makes it harder for us as well, because we know every organisation's different, but we're always trying to solve big problems and the complex ones. So we're always thinking about how do you do a psychosocial risk assessment properly, and how do you conduct a psychosocial investigations in a way that works for everybody and is not too hard and don't freak people out. This is a space that's complex. So we don't espouse to have all the answers, but we most definitely like to work with industry and regulators alike to work out how do we put all our good brains together and come up with a solution that is highly effective for everybody.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks, Kath.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.